July 7, 1972. A man steps off a plane at Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv. He walks with a limp and carries a leather satchel clutched tightly to his chest. His clothes are wrinkled from a sleepless flight. His eyes scan the terminal, not in fear but calculation. He doesn't go through customs. He's met at the gate by two men in civilian clothes who don't show credentials. They don't need to. The man follows them silently through a side door, disappears into a corridor, and for the next 17 hours the world forgets he exists. What the Mossad learns in that room will ripple through Washington, Moscow, Paris, and Berlin. It will shatter careers, unmask double agents, and force the KGB to burn entire networks it spent decades building. But it begins with this man, exhausted, trembling, and holding the weight of an empire's secrets in a single satchel. He calls himself Yuri. Not his real name, of course, but the name he used during his last years inside Soviet intelligence. Before the betrayal, before the exile, before the decision that made him a ghost to one side and a target to the other. In that room, he tells Mossad officers what they didn't dare hope was true, that he served inside Department Fey of the first Chief Directorate of the KGB, counterintelligence. Not just any department, the one responsible for controlling double agents inside the West. The Mossad officers don't interrupt much. They just let the man talk. And as the hours unfold, Yuri begins naming names. Names that shouldn't be possible. CIA officers, British analysts, German diplomats, French politicians, some dead, some still active, some working, at that very moment, inside NATO bunkers, reading classified reports. He speaks softly, never boasting, his voice strained with a mix of guilt and relief. Every name he utters turns into a cold file that Mossad begins pulling from their own archives. Many match. Some were already suspected. A few had been protected by others, too powerful to touch. By the end of the second day, Mossad understands what it has. A window into the most protected machinery of Soviet infiltration, and a man willing to tear it all down, piece by piece. But this story isn't about a single defection. It's about a chain of events that starts long before Yuri ever crossed the tarmac in Tel Aviv. And it's about a hidden war, a war of wires, whispers, and betrayals that made it possible for Mossad, a small intelligence service in a small country, to expose the KGB's secrets to the world. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union had one overwhelming advantage in the Cold War. Its spies were everywhere. From embassies in Paris to college campuses in London, from defense contractors in San Diego to NATO installations in Brussels, the KGB had placed operatives, couriers, and sympathizers in key positions across the Western world. These weren't just idealistic communists handing out pamphlets. They were trained officers, often recruited young, placed carefully, and fed assignments with surgical precision. To Moscow, espionage wasn't just a tool, it was the strategy. Subversion was how the Soviet Union planned to survive its economic and technological disadvantage. And the KGB was its sword and shield. Israel, too, understood the importance of intelligence. But unlike the United States or Britain, Israel couldn't afford bureaucratic infighting or second chances. One bad piece of intelligence could lead to thousands of deaths. That urgency made the Mossad aggressive, adaptive, and relentlessly patient. In the late 60s, Israeli intelligence began noticing something strange. High-level operations, previously airtight, were being compromised before they even launched. Meetings intercepted, agents rolled up, networks that had taken years to build suddenly collapsing overnight. Mossad suspected leaks, but not internal ones. They believed someone, somewhere high up in the Western services, was feeding information back to Moscow. They didn't have proof yet, just patterns. But in intelligence, patterns are everything. So Mossad did what it often does best. It started digging not into its own soil, but into everyone else's. They began quietly building files on every foreign diplomat stationed in Tel Aviv, then every journalist, then every contractor working with the Israeli military. Slowly, piece by piece, they widened the net. They weren't looking for spies in Israel. They were looking for echoes, indirect traces of what Soviet intelligence knew, when they knew it, and how they acted on it. And then something broke open. A routine signal intercept out of West Berlin flagged a coded message between two Eastern Bloc embassies. On its surface, the content seemed harmless, a discussion of agricultural exports, the kind of banal cover that filled diplomatic cables. But the timing was off. The embassy it referenced hadn't made any official visits that month. The language was slightly off too, certain idioms that weren't common to that region. Mossad analysts flagged the message and ran it through a compartmentalized cryptographic model. What they found stunned them. Buried inside that agricultural report was a rotating cipher, one that used Hebrew characters in reverse order. A KGB message was using Hebrew cipher keys. That wasn't accidental. Someone inside the Soviet system was signaling, not just leaking, but it wasn't a cry for help. It was bait. Mossad leadership knew what it meant. Someone inside the KGB, someone with access to codebooks, was trying to make contact. Not in Moscow, not in Berlin, but through a channel Israel could pick up, decode, and follow. It was a whisper from within the walls of the fortress. They launched a low-visibility operation under the name Keshet, Hebrew for arch. The idea was simple: establish a back channel that would allow the mysterious signaler to initiate contact without ever speaking aloud. What followed was a 6-month chess match played across radio frequencies, staged book drops, and the occasional use of intercepted weather reports encoded with geographic coordinates. No meetings, no face-to-face contact, just signals, always indirect, always deniable. It was Mossad's most delicate dance with defection, and then came the message they'd been waiting for, a sequence of 5 numbers wrapped inside a French public broadcast that matched a code previously agreed upon in Keshet. It included a date, a flight number, and a time. That was how Yuri arrived. The first interrogation wasn't an interrogation at all. It was a listening session. Mossad officers let him speak without interruption for hours. He described a world that even seasoned operatives found hard to believe. Rooms where assignments were handed down not with signatures, but glances. Agents trained to live dual lives so convincingly they sometimes forgot which was the original. Whole cities wired for surveillance, not by tapping phones, but by tapping people. He spoke of the KGB's Department V as a place without warmth, a place where silence was virtue, loyalty was weaponized, and identity was just another costume. What broke him, he said, wasn't ideology. It was watching how that machine crushed the people it used. His handler, a brilliant Georgian woman, had been disappeared for asking the wrong question about a colleague's sudden reassignment. Another friend, an idealistic linguist who once translated intercepted American cables, was arrested in the middle of the night and never returned. Their crime? Wondering why reports were being altered before being passed up the chain. He stayed silent for years, out of fear, out of habit. But the more he watched, the more he realized something terrifying. The KGB wasn't just spying on the West. It was eroding it, not through bombs, but through whispers, by placing operatives not just in enemy agencies, but in hearts and minds, in conversations that seemed safe. They didn't need to fight democracy. They could infect it. The moment that changed everything came in Vienna, he said. A meeting, a handshake, a passing of a file. He recognized the man on the other side, not a fellow Soviet, but a senior figure in the French Ministry of Energy, a man who had no idea his entire career was built on documents written in Moscow. That was when Yuri knew. The West didn't even know how deep the infection had gone. He didn't defect out of spite. He defected out of grief. Mossad verified his story the way they always did, with cold facts. They cross-referenced the names he gave. They tested his knowledge of procedures, call signs, dropped protocols. They even staged a fake leak of a minor operation to see if it would end up in Soviet hands through one of the names Yuri provided. It did, within 3 weeks. That confirmed everything. But the real challenge wasn't believing Yuri. It was deciding what to do with what he gave them. Revealing it all publicly would create chaos. Allies would feel betrayed. Intelligence relationships would collapse. Politicians might try to suppress the information to avoid scandal, but keeping it secret risked missing the moment. So Mossad devised a third path: controlled exposure, select leaks, carefully timed revelations, not to destroy trust in the West, but to purge it, to force Western agencies to confront the infection without tearing themselves apart. It began with a tip to the CIA, a name, a location, nothing more, enough to provoke an internal inquiry. Then came a similar note to MI6, then BND, then the DGSE in France. Each tip led to a quiet confrontation, a quiet firing, a quiet panic. But it was only the beginning. The first man to vanish was an attaché stationed in Geneva. Officially, he was transferred back to Moscow for reassignment. Unofficially, he was placed under house arrest, interrogated, and removed from all sensitive operations. Within weeks, 2 others disappeared, one from Vienna, one from Madrid. All 3 had names Yuri had spoken in that Tel Aviv briefing room. All 3 had been considered loyal, untouchable. The Kremlin didn't panic, not publicly, but beneath the polished exterior of Soviet control, the machinery began to grind. The KGB didn't understand what had happened. One of their own networks, carefully built over a decade, was crumbling, agent by agent. Files were sealed, internal reviews launched, but there was no warning, no pattern they could trace. It was as if someone knew their agents better than they did. That was precisely the point. Mossad had committed to a strategy of surgical exposure, not broadcasting what they knew, but leaking it in fragments, each time to inflict maximum paranoia. The goal was not just to eliminate specific assets, but to fracture trust inside the KGB, to make Moscow doubt its own people, and it worked. By late 1972, Soviet counterintelligence had launched an internal operation codenamed Cascade. The mission: identify how Israeli intelligence had gained access to names, files, and assignments that should have been protected by the most advanced security protocols in the Soviet arsenal? The answer remained elusive because the leak hadn't come from a document. It had come from a man who no longer existed. Yuri's identity had been erased. Mossad ensured no trace of him remained in any official Israeli records. He was resettled under a new name, provided with a life meticulously engineered to pass all scrutiny. The man who once walked KGB corridors now spent his mornings staring out at the Mediterranean, his only contact a monthly check-in with a handler posing as a doctor. But Yuri's knowledge wasn't finite. Over the following months, Mossad officers reconstructed entire Soviet operations from fragments he'd shared. Drop points in Zurich, signal patterns in Prague, financial transactions routed through Bulgarian shell companies. The volume of data was overwhelming. Mossad analysts began building what they called the Black Map, an interactive model of suspected Soviet infiltration across Western institutions. Each confirmed Soviet asset was marked red, each suspected was marked black, hence the name. Within a year, the map resembled a web stretching from Copenhagen to Buenos Aires. Mossad hadn't just exposed a few operatives, they'd identified the outlines of an empire. The operation began to change shape. What started as containment turned into exploitation. Mossad didn't just want to remove Soviet assets, they wanted to reverse the flow, use Soviet networks to feed misinformation back to Moscow. This required more than data, it required theater. In late 1973, an intercepted KGB communication revealed an impending handoff in Istanbul. A known courier was scheduled to retrieve sensitive documents from a compromised Greek official. Mossad saw an opportunity. They staged the handoff with actors, not amateurs but trained field officers capable of mimicking behavior, accents, and operational discipline. The documents the courier received were real in appearance but false in content, fabricated memos suggesting that the United States had developed a new satellite tracking algorithm capable of detecting Soviet submarines with unprecedented accuracy. The courier took the bait. He vanished into the night and delivered the documents to his handler. Weeks later, NATO reconnaissance confirmed that several Soviet subs had altered their standard patrol routes, avoiding key zones that had been falsified in the fake memo. It was proof Mossad had hijacked the signal, and they weren't done. In Washington, CIA analysts began noticing anomalies, Soviet trade deals being cancelled, certain diplomatic conversations ending abruptly, financial flows between Soviet banks and their international subsidiaries tightening in ways that defied normal economic behavior. They didn't know it yet, but they were witnessing the effects of Mossad's counter-leak strategy. By the end of 1974, Mossad had created a dossier, codename Ashal, outlining 24 high-ranking Soviet assets embedded in foreign governments, media, and defense industries. Most weren't in Israel. They were in allied countries. This created a diplomatic nightmare. If Israel informed its allies, it risked political retaliation. No government likes being told their intelligence agencies have been infiltrated, especially not by a smaller country. But staying silent meant letting the KGB continue operating unchallenged. So Israel made a calculated gamble. In January 1975, Mossad orchestrated a leak. A sanitized portion of the Ashal dossier was mailed anonymously to a French journalist known for anti-Soviet reporting. He published the names within days. The impact was immediate. Within 48 hours, the French government detained 3 of its own diplomats. In West Germany, counterintelligence services raided an East German cultural office and arrested 2 men believed to be running courier lines. In the US, the CIA launched an internal investigation so wide-ranging that 2 entire divisions were temporarily suspended. None of these actions were traced back to Israel. Mossad had exposed the network without drawing fire. But with every success came a risk. Moscow began retaliating. The first sign was subtle. A double agent Mossad had cultivated in Warsaw was found dead in his apartment, an apparent suicide. The local police ruled it natural causes, but Mossad's forensic review told a different story. 3 weeks later, a minor Israeli embassy official in London was nearly abducted while jogging. He escaped, but his handler had vanished. Then came the message, encrypted, brutal, clear. "Tell the fisherman the sea has teeth." It was a warning, and Mossad knew what it meant. The KGB had realized who was behind the unraveling. They had connected the leaks, the exposures, the misinformation, and they had decided to respond in kind. This changed everything. Israel could no longer operate from the shadows. The game had shifted from intelligence to counterintelligence, defense, protection, survival. A new directive was issued inside Mossad, Operation Zahav. Its mission was threefold: identify KGB operations targeting Israeli assets abroad, protect exposed double agents from retaliation, prepare counterstrikes to destabilize remaining Soviet networks. What followed was a period of intense shadow conflict, covert chases through European capitals, cryptographic battles in cables and couriers, and assassinations staged to look like accidents. But none of this reached the public, not yet, because Mossad had a final card to play, a revelation so vast, so damning that even the KGB would be forced to retreat. It wasn't another name or another leak, it was a man. Yuri wasn't alone. He had been part of a cell, a small, silent cluster of KGB officers who had long grown disillusioned with the regime. Men and women who had watched the institution they once believed in turn into a system of repression, silence, and deceit, and one of them had reached out. A woman, codename Tamar. She worked in a division so sensitive even Yuri hadn't known her real name. Her specialty was misdirection, designing disinformation campaigns to deceive Western intelligence, and she was willing to give it all up. Her contact came through the same indirect channels, a newspaper classified ad referencing a book she and Yuri had once discussed. It contained a date, a place, and a simple phrase: "One story deserves another." Mossad scrambled to verify. Was it real? A trap? A provocation by the KGB to draw out their assets? They ran background checks, surveillance sweeps, psychological profiling. All inconclusive, but they had no choice. Tamar had access to something Yuri didn't: the black box, a term whispered in intelligence circles to describe the KGB's internal database, a compilation of agent profiles, infiltration operations, code books, and tactical models, kept off network, accessible only to the highest clearance officers. If she was telling the truth, then the Mossad had a chance not just to wound the KGB's global network, but to rip it out by the roots. But it would require one final operation, a rendezvous, inside Soviet territory. It sounded like suicide, a Mossad operation inside Soviet territory, against a security apparatus that had spent decades perfecting surveillance, entrapment, and silent disappearance. One misstep and the operation wouldn't just fail, it would vanish. The agents, the assets, the entire trail would go dark. And yet that was exactly what Tamar proposed. Not a theft in the literal sense. She wasn't offering to smuggle out a file cabinet or walk out of a building with a briefcase handcuffed to her wrist. The black box didn't exist in any one physical location. It was distributed, locked in fragments across multiple secure nodes within Moscow, Leningrad, and Minsk. What she offered was access, because Tamar wasn't just a high-level officer. She had spent years as a systems architect inside the Department of Strategic Deception. Her job had been to compartmentalize operations so they couldn't be traced. She had helped build the very framework that now protected the KGB's most sensitive data, and she knew where the seams were. In a world of iron walls, she knew where the cracks ran. The initial plan called for a third-party rendezvous, neutral territory, plausible deniability, but Tamar insisted on one condition: she would not leave Soviet soil. Not yet, not because she feared Mossad, but because her position within the KGB gave her real-time access to live operations, rotating passphrases, and internal audits. If she vanished, the door would close forever. So the plan shifted. Mossad created a specialized task group, Division 12-7, drawn from field units, signals intelligence, and psychological operations. The name Glass Code was chosen to represent the fragility of the mission. One wrong move, and it shattered. They knew this couldn't be a traditional extraction. It had to be an exchange, a one-time, high-risk meeting to secure the access keys, locations, and methods Tamar would provide. Enough for Mossad analysts to begin recreating the black box outside the Iron Curtain. But who would be the one to meet her? The candidate had to be invisible, fluent in Russian, capable of improvisation under extreme pressure, emotionally compartmentalized, and ideally unknown to both the KGB and most of Mossad's own staff. They chose a man codenamed Avner. His real name had been erased years earlier. He had served as a deep-cover operative in Eastern Europe since 1968, operating in shadows even Mossad rarely acknowledged. His psychological profile marked him as ghost grade, capable of merging into any environment, surviving without contact, and executing operations without backup. But Avner wasn't chosen just for his tradecraft. He had history with Tamar. In 1971, while embedded in Prague, Avner had crossed paths with a Soviet cultural liaison, a woman who seemed to know more than her position allowed. Their interaction was brief, professional, but something in the file stood out, a phrase Avner had used in his debriefing. She asked questions like she already knew the answers. That was Tamar. And now, 3 years later, she was inviting him back into the fire. The operation required a fiction, a reason for Avner to enter Moscow without triggering suspicion. Mossad resurrected an old legend, a Canadian linguistics professor on sabbatical, specializing in Slavic languages. The cover was complete with university credentials, forged references, and a trail of fabricated academic papers. On March 3, 1975, Avner boarded a flight from Vienna to Moscow. His luggage contained nothing unusual: a few books, a notepad, a radio tucked inside a cassette recorder, modified to receive encrypted audio bursts. The rendezvous location was encoded in a crossword puzzle published in Pravda, using a pattern Tamar had described described to Mossad weeks earlier. Clue: a place for reflection, both literal and not. Answer: Zerkalny Sad, the Mirror Garden, a small neglected public space tucked between residential blocks in Moscow's Sokolniki district. Avner arrived at 11:12 a.m., wearing a scarf and glasses. He sat on a wooden bench beneath a birch tree that hadn't yet budded for spring. Tamar was already there. She didn't approach at first, just sat, 10 meters away, feeding crumbs to pigeons. She looked ordinary, older than her file photo, with hair streaked grey at the temples. She wore no makeup. Her coat had a rip in the sleeve. They made no eye contact, no exchange. At exactly 11:20 a.m., she stood, dropped a matchbook near the trash bin, and walked away. Avner retrieved it. Inside was a single word: Chernitsa, a monastery 2 hours outside the city. The next meeting would take place there. Mossad's rules for field agents were clear: never follow bait twice. If something looks too easy, it usually is. But Tamar had anticipated the risk and embedded a verification code into the matchbook, a sequence of numbers Avner had once scrawled in the margins of a forged letter during his time in Prague. Only someone with access to that surveillance file could have known. This wasn't bait, this was real. 2 days later, Avner made his way to Chernitsa, posing as a historian researching Orthodox architecture. Tamar met him inside the ruins of the bell tower early in the morning as fog curled through broken stone windows. This time they spoke. She didn't smile, she didn't apologize. She simply unbuttoned her coat and revealed what she had brought: a notebook, handwritten, coded. It contained 53 pages. Each page listed access protocols, system addresses, and procedural rotas for the black box. It wasn't the full database, but it was the blueprint. She had memorized it, then destroyed the originals. Over 2 hours, she recited the contents aloud while Avner transcribed them using his own cipher. The fog never lifted. They never once said each other's names. Before parting, she whispered one phrase: "I have 3 more drops prepared. If I don't signal in 12 days, destroy the chain." Avner nodded. Then he vanished. He would never see her again. The data he returned with stunned Mossad analysts. It was more than they'd hoped for. The protocols outlined a distributed architecture that fed all KGB infiltration intelligence into 3 major nodes, codenamed Rodina, Volga, and Obelisk. Each node served a different purpose. Rodina stored agent dossiers. Volga coordinated operational timelines and logistics. Obelisk handled disinformation flow and diplomatic manipulation. Crucially, the notebook Tamar provided revealed the relay systems between these nodes, data transfers that occurred monthly via analog batch scripts manually delivered by trained couriers. This was the KGB's weak point. The black box wasn't some untouchable monolith. It was a process, a human-dependent system that could be intercepted. For Mossad, it was the breakthrough of the decade. They now had a map, not just of who the KGB had planted, but how those operatives were coordinated. And that changed everything. Over the next 6 months, Mossad launched 14 coordinated operations across Europe. None of them looked like spy games. No car chases, no dramatic arrests. But inside NATO's Brussels headquarters, 2 senior analysts were quietly retired. In Athens, a shipment of Soviet diplomatic mail was accidentally delayed and then copied. In Stockholm, a journalist with suspected ties to Moscow was exposed using a leaked phone log, each action carefully designed to look like coincidence. But behind each one was the data Tamar had delivered. The KGB's global network began to atrophy, not because it was destroyed, but because it no longer trusted itself. Every operation risked exposure. Every courier feared interception. Every asset felt the walls tightening. The Soviets knew something was wrong, but they didn't know how Mossad had gotten inside. They suspected defection, but not Tamar. She was too high-ranking, too clean. Still, they searched. And one day, the signals stopped. No message in the crossword, no classified ad, no dead drop. Avner waited the 12 days, then a 13th, then a 14th. On the 15th, Mossad burned the chain. Tamar was gone. They never learned what happened. Some believed she was found and executed. Others whispered she had fled, hidden in some remote village under a new name, watching the empire she had helped build slowly rot from the inside. But her legacy remained. By the end of 1976, Mossad had successfully exposed, disrupted, or neutralized over 60 Soviet operations across 5 continents. They'd done it without triggering global panic, without revealing their sources, and without firing a single shot. And yet the war wasn't over, because Moscow was adapting, learning, preparing something new, and Mossad was already 1 step behind. By the winter of 1976, the balance of intelligence warfare had shifted. For the first time since the Cold War began, the Soviet Union no longer held the advantage in subversion. The damage Mossad inflicted with Tamar's blueprint and Yuri's testimony had forced the KGB to pull dozens of operatives from Europe, sever contact with long-term assets, and shut down entire communication corridors between Moscow and its satellite networks. But the KGB did not retreat, it recalibrated. What came next was not a wave of assassinations or bold countermeasures. It was something far more insidious, a psychological war designed to break Mossad from within. The Soviets had a name for it, Program Marakhno, meaning twilight. Its goal was to turn Mossad's strength, its tight, decentralized operations, against itself by implanting paranoia, confusion, and phantom signals deep inside Israel's most elite intelligence corridors. The method was unorthodox. Rather than attempt to infiltrate agents into Israeli soil, which had proven nearly impossible, the KGB would make Mossad believe it had already been infiltrated. And that belief, if fed carefully, could tear the agency apart from the inside. It started with a whisper. In late January 1977, a low-priority Israeli outpost in Nairobi received a parcel addressed to Lior Nave. There was no one by that name in the outpost. The return address was a hotel in Geneva. The contents? A book of Russian poetry, unmarked, except it wasn't. Tucked between pages was a microdot embedded in the corner of a footnote, barely visible even under magnification. When decoded, it contained a message written in Hebrew. Your walls are lower than you think. One of you belongs to us. The message was signed RB. Within 24 hours, it was on the desk of Mossad's counterintelligence chief. The implications were staggering. The Soviets weren't just saying they had penetrated Mossad. They were taunting them, and worse, there was no Lior Nave in Mossad's records, but a former field operative named Nave had disappeared during a botched mission in Hungary 3 years prior. He was presumed dead. His body was never found. Suddenly, that absence became a question mark. Had he been turned? Had he survived? Was he still active under a new name? Mossad launched an internal sweep, Operation Barzilay. Unlike traditional purges, this wasn't about rooting out obvious leaks. It was about mapping every unexplained deviation in behavior over the last 5 years. Every misfiled report, every intercepted communication, every asset that had gone dark under ambiguous circumstances. Analysts were pulled from field duty and told to profile each other's past decisions. Trusted operatives were interrogated in controlled environments, not accused, but studied for inconsistencies in narrative recall. No one was arrested, no one was cleared, everyone was suspect. This was exactly what the KGB intended. At the same time, subtle anomalies began to surface in field operations. In Cyprus, a Mossad dead drop location was found emptied, yet no one on record had accessed it. In Bucharest, an Israeli-friendly informant vanished 2 hours after reporting he had spotted someone familiar from training. In Amsterdam, a Mossad safe house was broken into, but nothing was stolen. Just a single sheet of paper was left on the floor. It read, "Still watching." The psychological toll was immense. Field officers began second-guessing each other. Communications teams ran triple verification on every inbound report. Missions were delayed, altered, or cancelled out of fear that the enemy already knew the plan. Veteran handlers, those with 2 decades of operations under their belt, began asking a quiet, terrifying question. What if we're not who we think we are anymore? Mossad leadership faced a dilemma. If they acknowledged the possibility of a mole, it validated the KGB's campaign. If they dismissed it, they risked ignoring a genuine threat. So they chose a third path, bait the KGB into overplaying its hand. They created a phantom operative, a fictional Mossad field agent named Ami Ben David, carefully inserted into chatter, field briefings, and even a few forged intercepts planted to be picked up by Soviet signals intelligence. Ben David had a fake record, a fake mission, a fake series of successes, and a rising status in the imaginary world of Western counter-espionage. The KGB took the bait. Within weeks, a report surfaced from a German wiretap of a known Soviet relay station in Dresden. A low-level transmission referenced ABD as someone to be assessed for targeting. It was confirmation. The KGB believed in a man who did not exist. But more importantly, Mossad knew how they had acquired that information. The forged intercept had been transmitted via a compromised NATO channel shared with West German intelligence. The leak wasn't inside Mossad. It was in Bonn. This discovery cracked open the final phase of the silent war. Mossad passed the intel discreetly to the CIA, who ran their own verification. The source of the leak was traced to a West German liaison officer whose sister had been quietly living in East Berlin for years. A known KGB pressure tactic. The officer was removed. The channel was shut down. The KGB had lost one of its few remaining footholds into Mossad's world, but they weren't done. In March 1978, Mossad received an intercepted cable sent from Sofia to Warsaw. It referenced an asset inside Zone Aleph, a codename sometimes used for Mossad's operational planning division. The cable contained a warning. The sun has risen. Burn the file. For a moment, it seemed to confirm Mossad's worst fear, that the KGB had successfully embedded a long-term asset inside their central planning structure. But something was off. The syntax was wrong, the encryption was old, and the call signs didn't match current KGB protocol. Upon closer inspection, analysts realized the message had not been intercepted. It had been planted by the Soviets. For Mossad, it was theater. The KGB wasn't revealing an asset. They were manufacturing panic. The intention was simple: force Mossad to purge itself into paralysis. But Mossad didn't bite. Instead, they ran a mirror operation. They fabricated a counter-message, leaked intentionally via an Allied embassy in Vienna, suggesting Mossad had compromised the Warsaw courier chain. 2 weeks later, the KGB shut down its Warsaw relay. Mossad's counterintelligence had struck again. Yet even in victory, the damage was evident. The Phantom War had changed Mossad. The agency that once thrived on independence and intuition had become more cautious, more bureaucratic. Every decision was second-guessed, every victory viewed with suspicion. Even Yuri, the man whose defection had started it all, sensed the shift. In a rare communication to his handler in 1979, he wrote, "You've won more than you know, but something's been lost too. You don't trust your shadows anymore." It was true. The KGB, even in losing, had managed to plant its most effective weapon yet: fear. But Mossad was not defeated. In late 1979, a new message arrived, this time not from within Soviet territory, but from Tehran. The Islamic Revolution had just shaken Iran to its core. Embassies burned, files looted, and among the chaos, a Mossad-connected informant smuggled out a briefcase left behind by a fleeing East German diplomat. Inside were photographs, cables, lists, and one document labeled Initiative Nadir. It detailed a KGB plan to re-establish operations in the Middle East, using newly radicalized elements in Lebanon and Syria, creating cover for Soviet operatives under the guise of revolutionary solidarity. The Ghost War was about to evolve. Mossad wasn't just fighting a Cold War enemy anymore. It was now navigating a world where ideologies bled into espionage, and where state actors merged with extremists. And somewhere in that convergence, the next threat was forming. But so was the final opportunity, because buried in the Nadir files was a name no one expected to see again. Tamar. She wasn't dead, and she was reaching out. The page was brittle, scorched at the edge, as if singed by fire before someone tucked it into the East German diplomat's briefcase. It didn't carry her real name, just the alias she'd used during her first contact with Mossad, Tamar. The document was part of a collection marked Initiative Nadir, a KGB proposal to exploit the instability following the Iranian Revolution. But the page that mattered wasn't strategy. It was a message, written in careful, slanted Cyrillic, almost like handwriting on a page never meant to be read again. Tell Avner, the arch still stands. 3 years. 3 years since she'd vanished without a trace after giving Mossad access to the black box protocols. 3 years since her last signal. Her silence had been honored by protocol. Destroy the chain, protect the source. She was presumed dead, or worse, taken. But this wasn't a forgery. The handwriting was hers. The code phrase matched the one she and Avner had used during the Chernitsa exchange. She was alive. Somewhere inside the collapsing Soviet sphere of influence, Tamar had re-emerged. And this time, her message wasn't about access. It was about collapse. In the weeks that followed, Mossad analysts pored over the Initiative Nadir cache. On the surface, it looked like just another realignment, a KGB blueprint to build new intelligence pipelines through Arab nationalist groups and anti-Western factions in the Middle East. But Tamar had embedded something deeper, not a cipher, a flaw. She had rewritten part of the plan's tactical assessment, subtly altered casualty projections, exaggerated asset reliability ratings, and inserted references to non-existent channels. She'd built a time bomb into the strategy itself, a fake architecture of infiltration that, if followed, would lead the KGB directly into operational failure. And they had followed it. In Beirut, a Soviet agent posing as a Syrian academic vanished after contacting a Mossad-monitored network. In Tripoli, a diplomatic attaché was caught transmitting fabricated resistance manifestos believed to be genuine. Across half a dozen capitals, KGB operatives acted on false assumptions, burning their own assets, misallocating funds, and exposing themselves in the process. Mossad didn't intercept these failures. They watched them. They had been gifted something rare in the intelligence world: strategic sabotage from inside the enemy's own planning bureau. It was confirmation that Tamar hadn't just survived. She was inside again, embedded, active, and she had made a choice, not just to leak information, but to engineer failure. But this created a new problem. How do you extract someone so deeply buried without triggering suspicion? How do you rescue the ghost without alerting the gravekeeper? Mossad knew they wouldn't get another chance. Tamar's position wouldn't survive another wave of sabotage. Her access, her life, would expire the moment someone inside the KGB recognized the pattern. So they devised one final operation, codename Shalom, Hebrew for dream, because that's what it was, a mission so improbable it bordered on fantasy. Extract a double agent from inside the Soviet Union using nothing but suggestion, false trails, and one last message. The first step was misinformation. Mossad fed 3 separate Western intelligence agencies, unknowingly, discreet leaks suggesting that an internal review in Moscow had uncovered the source of a major security breach. These leaks named a fabricated KGB officer, Dmitry Ulin, a completely fictional character with a backstory crafted from fragments of real operatives. As planned, the information filtered back to Moscow through routine inter-agency cooperation channels. And there, it triggered what Mossad had anticipated, a mole hunt, but for the wrong person. While Moscow turned inward, chasing a ghost, Tamar was instructed to send a single, innocuous message through a channel she knew would be flagged by her own security team. A journal article on Western disinformation tactics, submitted to a minor academic publication in Riga. Mossad intercepted the article through a Latvian contact before it went public. Hidden in the abstract were 4 misspelled words, each a cipher key. Together, they revealed a meeting place, a date, and a phrase. I am no longer theirs. She was ready. The exfiltration was planned not by Mossad alone, but through a joint operation with 2 other intelligence services, one American, one French, both of whom had directly benefited from Tamar's sabotage of Soviet operations. They provided diplomatic cover, extraction routes, and critical infrastructure. Mossad provided the operative. And of course, that operative was Avner. He was brought out of deep retirement for the mission, not because he was the best, but because he was the only one Tamar would trust. He didn't hesitate. The rendezvous was set for October 12, 1980, at a rail station in Rostov-on-Don, disguised as an academic conference. Tamar arrived wearing a black wool coat, a worn satchel at her side. She carried no identification, no papers, just a folded scarf with the same embroidered pattern she'd worn the day they met in Chernitsa. Avner approached from behind a newsstand. He didn't speak. He simply stood beside her. She turned, and for the first time in 9 years, she smiled. It lasted less than 4 seconds. Then she said, "We don't have long." They made their way through the city like strangers, never walking side by side, never speaking again until they reached a small cargo terminal at the outskirts of town. A maintenance truck waited, its driver paid off weeks in advance to take sensitive radio equipment to a border checkpoint near Ukraine. At the checkpoint, they boarded a French diplomatic transport convoy carrying relief supplies to Poland. From there, they passed into East Germany, then West, and then finally to Israel. Tamar never looked back. In Tel Aviv, she spent 6 weeks in debriefing, not interrogated, listened to. What she carried wasn't just secrets, it was structure. She confirmed that Initiative Nadir had collapsed, that Soviet leadership had lost confidence in its Middle East operatives, that entire networks had been abandoned without explanation. But her final revelation was larger. In her last position, Tamar had been given access to an internal KGB report titled Strategicheski, Tuman, Strategic Fog. It was a classified self-assessment created by a division of the Soviet General Staff. It admitted in stark language that over the previous 5 years, the effectiveness of foreign operations had declined by 48%. The report didn't know why. It listed possibilities: NATO surveillance improvements, increased operational risk, Western counterintelligence enhancements. Nowhere did it suspect that the entire time, it had been bleeding from a wound no one could see, because that wound had a name: Israel. In the end, the war didn't end with a bang. It ended with a vacuum. By the mid-1980s, the KGB had all but ceased major operations in Israel. They had redirected their resources toward Europe, Asia, and domestic control. Their losses in the Middle East had become too costly, too humiliating. The Mossad had done something no one thought possible. They had infiltrated the infiltrators. They had turned secrecy into a weapon not by louder violence or bigger budgets, but through patience, human psychology, and the rarest of traits in intelligence work: belief. Yuri, Avner, Tamar, none of them were perfect. Each carried guilt like a second skin. Each had walked into the darkness knowing they might never walk back out. But because of them, the map of the Cold War shifted. Because of them, the world learned that the most powerful intelligence agency in the world could be deceived. And because of them, a small nation with few allies and fewer resources managed to do what the CIA, MI6, and DGSE could not. It exposed the hidden machinery of the KGB. It turned secrets into ruin. And it won a war that history almost never recorded.